whenever you want it.
Buenas tardes y bienvenidos a la clase magistral Masterclass on B Language Acquisition for Conference Interpreters. Durante la charla, les solicitamos por favor mantener sus micrófonos silenciados para evitar interferencias. El chat se encuentra activo para realizar preguntas y comentarios que compartiremos al finalizar la charla. Damos inicio ahora a la grabación de la sesión. Mi nombre es Verónica Repetti, soy la prosecretaria académica de la Escuela de Lenguas Modernas de la Universidad de El Salvador, y antes de comenzar esta clase magistral con Chris Guillot de Fortis, que nos acompaña hoy, a quien tenemos mucho gusto de recibir, nos gustaría contarles sobre la Escuela de Lenguas Modernas de la USAL, y en especial sobre su oferta académica en el área de interpretación de conferencias, en la que contamos con una larga trayectoria. Actualmente ofrecemos, además de la carrera de grado de licenciatura en interpretación de conferencias en inglés, una carrera de posgrado para traductores públicos de inglés que quieran formarse como intérpretes en el ámbito judicial. Esta es la especialización en interpretación pericial en inglés. Y además, este año hemos incorporado una diplomatura universitaria en técnicas de la interpretación inglés-español para que todos los interesados puedan formarse en las técnicas de interpretación simultánea y consecutiva. Y por último, también contamos con un curso de extensión en interpretación italiano-español que se dicta en 2 niveles anuales. Le doy ahora la palabra a mi colega Norma Andrada, graduada de la USAL y docente titular de las cátedras de interpretación consecutiva y simultánea de la carrera de licenciatura en interpretación de conferencias en inglés. Y además Norma coordina la carrera de posgrado, la que mencioné, la especialización, y la diplomatura universitaria en técnicas de la interpretación. Adelante, Norma, con la presentación de nuestro invitado.
Muchas gracias, Verónica. Bueno, buenas tardes a todos. Tengo el placer de presentar a nuestro expositor, Chris Guillot de Fortis, máster en Lenguas Modernas y PhD en Literatura Francesa del St. John's College, Cambridge, posgrado en Interpretación de Conferencias en la Universidad de Bath, en el Reino Unido. Se ha desempeñado como intérprete senior de planta permanente de la OTAN en Bruselas, intérprete voluntario para diversas organizaciones no gubernamentales como Emmaus International, Médicos Sin Fronteras, Amnistía Internacional, miembro de AIIC, a cargo del programa de capacitación de profesores de interpretación, Train to Trainers, en Bélgica y en Francia, entre otras actividades. Es director del Cambridge Conference Interpretation Course en el Reino Unido. Es miembro de la Junta Examinadora de las Universidades de Manchester, de Lieja en Bélgica, del AIIC en París y Bruselas, entre otras, y es cofundador de Olivier 1996. Es una organización benéfica de servicios legales y sociales para refugiados. Chris, you have the floor.
Thank you, Norma. Thank you, Veronica. Thank you, Paula. And thank you all for coming. I was about to say tonight, because for me it's 10 in the evening, but for you it's the afternoon, I believe. It's nice to see you all anyway. I can see most of you. And thank you for that wonderful introduction. I didn't recognize it as being myself. I didn't know I'd done all those things, but I am old, so I've had plenty of time to do stuff. I'm very keen on B languages, and I know you are too, because in the market I worked in for the last 32 years with English, French by active interpretation, the B language was the most important factor distinguishing good interpreters from bad interpreters. And the quality of the B language is something which is very dear to my heart. I think, in fact, in general, in the world of interpreting, a lot of interpreters work biactively, and we'll talk about the terminology during my class. But a lot of people don't work very well in their B language. And I think there's a massive amount of scope to improve the quality of people's B languages. You might even say it's probably the weakest facet of our profession worldwide. And we'll talk about that. We'll talk about definitions of B languages and how you can improve your B. And then I will talk, well, I'll just share my screen first and I'll start to talk about what my presentation. Apparently I have to be given the chance to share my screen because I can't currently. So I'll let you do that.
Yeah,
Sorry.
We won't get far otherwise. You'll have to listen to me talking and I won't be able to show you my screen. That's better. Thank you very much. It seems to be working now. So are you all seeing the screen okay?
Yes.
It's so hard online because you never know whether people are seeing what you hope they're seeing. By the way, do stop me if I speak too fast. I'm trying to speak extremely slowly now because I tend to speak extremely fast. And so if it goes too fast, somebody shout and tell me to slow down. And the more carried away I get, the more enthusiastic I get, the more I tend to speak fast.
Thank you.
I apologize for this first slide because in fact, usually I present this presentation together with my wife, Julia. But I forgot to change it and take her name off, but she is with me in spirit. So what we're going to do tonight is talk about B languages in general. And if you go to this link at some stage, if you ever want to and you have time, this is the website to the Cambridge Conference Interpretation course that Norma just spoke about. And there is a section marked texts. And if you click on the section marked texts, you will find all the training texts that I've written, because I do a lot of training. I train, as Norma was saying, interpreters in about 6 different countries and about 25 different interpreting schools. And I've written a lot of things about how to train, how to work on stress, how to work on preparing texts, how to work on B languages. And I wrote one very recently, in fact, which is a very lengthy text about how to work in what I call degraded mode, which means when you can't interpret 100% of what's being said, for whatever reason, how do you intelligently reduce what you're interpreting? So you might find those texts interesting. I hope so. This masterclass, there are basically three sections. First of all, I look quite quickly at what is the point of having a second active language. And currently I'm using the term second active language rather than B language. Then one of the biggest parts of the talk is about defining what a B language is. Now, that may seem superfluous to you, but it's not, because in our profession, I've been a member of AIIC for 30 years now. In our profession, there is a lot of misunderstanding about what a B language actually is. And the first thing to do is to make sure that we know what we're talking about and we know what we're advertising when we advertise ourselves as bi-active interpreters. What does that actually mean? And then the third part of the class is maybe the part you want most, which is the practical part of how to go about either acquiring a B language or improving your B language. And that's also about 25 slides. And the whole thing should take a couple of hours. So I hope you'll bear with me. I agreed with your teaching staff that we'd run through the whole briefing first, and then I'd be happy to stay for as long as you like to answer any questions you might have. I hope that's okay with you.
Thank you.
So, thank you. Let me just clarify a couple of things before we start talking about B languages. The first thing is, even though the market increasingly requires interpreters to work bi-actively, you don't have to have a B language, obviously, and not all interpreters do have a B language or are able to have one. It's not necessarily possible for everybody. That being said, the middle comment here is something which I think is very important. If you are assessed correctly by people who know about the profession, who are good teachers, and if you are then coached correctly, most interpreters can develop a proper B language. There are some who can't, and it's not a source of shame, it's just a different market. But as long as the assessment is done correctly and people are able to say, yes, this is where you stand, and then if you're properly coached by people who understand what the market requires and understand that working with a B language is not the same as working with an A language, and we will talk about this later, most people can develop a B. And the bottom comment, I think, is obvious to everybody. I don't suppose you need to be told this, that having a B language is a big asset to an interpreter, especially in your market, I believe, because I think in Argentina, like in many countries in the world, working without a B is almost impossible, because everybody has a B pretty much, or everybody has to say they have a B, which isn't the same thing. I just trying to have to move my slide down because my thing has moved. Right, here we are. Okay, now one thing I also want to point out very clearly from the start is that having a bad B language, or having a B language which is not really a B language, which is a C, and saying to people, to customers, I will interpret from, for example, Spanish into English, and your English isn't good enough, you are doing a big disservice to the entire interpreting profession. And this happens quite frequently because there are a lot of bad B languages that are advertised by interpreters throughout the world. And the problem is that when customers, paying customers, hear a bad B language being used, they say, oh, if that's what interpreting is, then we can save our money. We don't need to pay money because we can do this well ourselves. So I think probably it is the single facet of our profession worldwide which requires improvement the most, because it's a big showcase for how interpreters carry out their functions. How good is our B? Is our B really a B? Can we really get complicated, subtle arguments across in our second active language? I should just point out before we go any further that I have two A languages. I have French and English as my A's, and Spanish as my C. In some circumstances, my English is stronger than my French, and in some circumstances, the opposite is true. But I've worked all my career between the two languages, and so I've developed a bit of expertise in that field. So let's move on to the first part of the class, which is why is it desirable to acquire a second active language as an interpreter? Well, there are lots and lots of reasons. One of the most important reasons is that today the world is moving very fast. Time is money. Increasingly, when people hire an interpreter, they are demanding. They want cost effectiveness. They want a good product for the money they're spending. They want speed. You need to be able to interpret quickly, because these days, conferences see people speaking much faster than 10 or 15 years ago. I've been interpreting for just over 30 years, and the average speed of a speaker in a conference today is at least 40% higher than it was 30 years ago. So we need to be fast. We need to provide efficiency, and we need to supply clear and accurate communication. That's what the world wants from us, the world of industry, the world of international organizations, where we are called to work. We have to be good. And of course, if you look at the cost side of interpreting to the employer, if you take a typical NGO meeting, now the good news for many of you probably is that you probably have these three languages in your combination, English, French, and Spanish. And these are the standard languages for NGOs. Now, if you hire 3 monolingual booths, if you're an employer, 1 into English, 1 into French, and 1 into Spanish, you are hiring 6 interpreters. Now, I don't know exactly what the tariff is in Argentina for a day's interpreting, but this is about the standard tariff in Paris for interpreters. So it's going to cost you 3,900 euros. If you hire 2 biactive booths, 1 English French and 1 English Spanish, then you're only hiring 4 interpreters and you're saving 33% of your money. So as I put it at the bottom here, it's a complete no-brainer. So no employer is going to go for this option here when they could choose this option here. So that means that having a B language is pretty much indispensable these days. It's what the world wants. This is something which you may or may not have thought about. It may not apply to you if you're all Spanish A, but if you speak what's called an exotic language, let's say Russian or Chinese or Japanese, if your mother tongue is exotic, or if it's a very political language. Now, by a political language, I mean a language that is intimately linked to the world of geopolitics. Turkish, for example, is very much linked to the way in which Turkey relates to the world. And it's in a very tumultuous relationship with other countries at the moment. Russia is the same, of course. So if you have one of these languages as your A language, you have to be biactive, because you will never ever get hired if you can't do a retour. For example, in the UN, you know, the UN obviously has 6 languages. The Chinese booth and the Russian booth are the only booths that do the retour. They do AB, BA. Every other booth only works into the A language. So if you do happen to have one of these exotic languages as a mother tongue, then you really have no choice at all but to have a retour, and usually English. This is another thing here. I don't know if you've thought about this. International meetings these days, particularly on the private market, are increasingly held in what we call Globish. Now, I imagine you call it Globish also in Argentina, you know, English being spoken as a second language, which is not actually English, it's a different language, if you ask me. I spent 32 years interpreting delegates at NATO headquarters in Brussels, most of whom speak English as a foreign language. And believe me, it is not actually English, it's a separate language. Very often it only comprises a few hundred words. In French, we call it désespéranto, which is despairing Esperanto, because it's such a poor way of communicating. Now, because most meetings these days are being held exclusively in English spoken as a second language, there is no English booth. Because if you're in the English booth, you don't work very much. Last night, I had dinner with a colleague of mine who was a student of mine, and she works as a staff interpreter at the European Commission. And she was saying that there are entire days where she sits in the booth, in the English booth, and never opens her mouth once. And so increasingly, employers are saying, why are we wasting money hiring English A interpreters when they aren't working? Because everybody's speaking English on the floor. So that means, again, that having an English B language is almost essential these days, because English A's there's not enough work to make it viable. So the good news is that all these things I've just talked about increases the demand for good biactive interpreters. But the word good is in capitals, because many, many biactive interpreters are not good. And we'll come to that in a minute. And the bad news, of course, is that it's a very competitive market. Now, I've got a few statistics I'm going to show you. I don't think I have statistics on the Argentinian market, but I don't think it's different from the other markets that I do show you. Let me move on now to another aspect of why it is desirable to have a B language. Now, if you work, for example, for the European Union, which I know most of you don't, because of course you're living in Argentina, which is a long way from Belgium. If you want to work for the European Union and other employers through the world, they often require that you have 3 C languages. Now, not everybody has 3 C languages. I haven't got 3 C languages. I have an A, or I have 2 A's and a C. But if you have the ability to do C, A, and A, B biactively, you can cover 2 different markets. So my wife, for example, she has English A, Russian B, and French C. So she can work in the English-Russian booth, which she often does for the UN. So there you have A, B, B, A. That's one market, which is a biactive market. And she also covers the CA market, which is Russian and French into English, which is her A. So these are 2 different markets, which are completely separate. This is international organizations on the whole, or the private market. And this is a completely different mode. This is the UN or the European Union, where you only work from a C into an A. So if you have a B language, you can cover both these markets, which means if you're freelance, you get more work, because you can appeal to 2 completely different sorts of market. I hope you're following me. I hope I'm not going too fast. So that makes a B language a very desirable addition to your language combination. Another reason why a B is useful, like I mentioned a few minutes ago, is if you want to work for the EU in accreditation tests, your B language counts as an extra language. So if you have English B, it counts as a C and a B. So this will give you access to tests where otherwise you would not be given a test, because the EU is quite demanding about the number of languages they require their interpreters to have. Now, I know it's not a prime consideration for you because you're on the other side of the world, but if you come to Europe, it may become a big consideration for you. So the B is a very desirable tool to have in your toolbox. Now, all these things are empirical ideas which I have from my 32 years of being a conference interpreter, but I wanted to support my empirical feeling with statistics. So I had a look at the AIIC yearbook. Now, I don't know if any of you here are members of AIIC or are close to AIIC or are pre-candidates of AIIC, but of course AIIC is the only international interpreting body. I'm not saying it's the best necessarily, but it is a very good way of finding out statistics about our profession if you look at the handbook. So I sampled the handbook, and these are the figures which I came up with as regards B languages. So I sampled almost 2,000 members of AIIC, and the overall figure of interpreters who are biactive, who have 2 active languages, was 78%. And this figure is the same as it was in 2013. So here we have the number of interpreters who work in these various places. So here we have just a random list of countries and cities. This is the number of AIIC members in each of these places. And you'll see that Brussels is the biggest, Paris is the second biggest, and Geneva is the third biggest. These are the 3 big international centers for conference interpreters. Here are the figures for 2013. They've changed slightly, but not massively. And here we have the percentages of biactive interpreters. So you'll see, for example, that in Milan, 97% have a B language. In Paris, 91%. In Munich, 88%. In Berlin, 89%. And so it goes on. You can see it's the vast majority of interpreters in the world. These are professional AIIC members, have a B language or even 2 B languages sometimes, at least 1. The only city in the world where B language interpreters are not in the majority is Brussels, where I'm working myself, because of course Brussels houses the European Union, and the European Union doesn't lay much stress on B languages. Some, but not much. So all this in summary is to indicate that it's important to have a B language, basically. I perhaps could have said that right at the beginning and saved a quarter of an hour. I hope you find the statistics convincing, because they don't lie. You know, overall, 4 out of 5 interpreters in the world, if you take AIIC as a representative example, have 2 active languages. Now, let me try and free up my slides again. Right, so let's now turn to the second part of the class and say, what exactly is a B language? How do we define it? The first thing is to use terminology which everybody understands. Now, I don't know what terminology you use in Argentina. I assume you say B language because that is the title of the presentation which you gave. You gave me the title. Yeah, we use the word retour. I've been using it tonight. The word retour is usually used by the European Union frequently. A lot of international organizations talk about a retour as well, which is your second language. Biactive is a term that I like to use. It's a term we use at NATO headquarters, where I have worked my entire career, because biactive obviously is an interpreter's word. I actually remember when I first applied to work at NATO, I was studying interpreting at the Bath School in the UK, and I applied to NATO, and they wrote back saying, yes, we do need people with your biactive profile. Now, I'd never heard that word when I was 23, when I was 30 years old, when I became an interpreter, and I didn't know what it was. I thought it was something sexual. And I then understood that biactive is in fact a technical interpreter's word for somebody who works A, B, B, A, or double A, A, A. Then, of course, we have the B language, which is probably the clearest definition. AIIC uses it. And then we have bilingual. Now, I I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about bilingualism, because bilingualism is what we call in English a red herring. I don't know whether you understand what a red herring is in English. It means something which is a false truth, basically. It's something that has no importance, but seems to be important. It doesn't matter whether you're bilingual or not. What matters is, are you a good interpreter? And what also matters is, do you know how to use your B language effectively? Because the strategy you need to work into a B language is not the same as an A language. So bilingual people are actually extremely rare, because I don't know whether you use the word very frequently in Argentina, but in Belgium, for example, the word bilingual is used a lot, because Belgium has 3 national languages, Flemish, French, and German. And if, for example, you want to work in a shoe shop, for example, most people will have to be what they call bilingual. But of course, they aren't bilingual at all. They're not bilingual by the standards of interpreting. They're bilingual in that they can order shoes in 2 languages. And that makes them bilingual in the way in which Belgium uses the word bilingual. But for us interpreters, bilingualism is a huge thing, because it means you have to be functionally bilingual, culturally bilingual, emotionally bilingual, and linguistically bilingual. And people who have all these assets in their nature are very, very rare indeed. In AIIC, probably about 5% of members of AIIC are AA interpreters, truly bilingual. It doesn't matter. People talk about it a lot, but it doesn't have a great deal of importance really in the interpreting world. For example, when I was again training in Bath, we had a colleague of mine who was in the same year as me, and she was half Irish and half French. And she genuinely was truly bilingual, culturally, mentally, psychologically, and linguistically, but she couldn't tell the difference between the 2 languages. And so if you didn't stop her, sometimes she would spend a whole half hour interpreting simultaneously from French into French, because she didn't realize she wasn't changing languages. Because you may or may not be aware of this, but if you're a true bilingual, the 2 languages are actually housed in the same part of your brain, which means your brain doesn't distinguish between them. So you're actually much better off having a very good B language, which is a clear foreign language, and using it correctly. So a good A-B interpreter is better than a bad AA interpreter. So from now on, we can forget about being bilingual. It's not important. Now, a true B language, and I put the word true in yellow here because there are lots of false B languages. A true B language is a second active language. That's clear, I think, to everybody. Usable in consecutive and simultaneous. Not just consecutive. Now, the AIIC handbook, which you may have a copy of in your school, I don't know, I hope you do, says that it's acceptable for 2 things to happen with a B language B. So, for example, if you have my wife with English A, Russian B, French C, she doesn't do French into Russian. And that's acceptable. There's no obligation as a conference interpreter to work from your C into your B. If you can, so much the better. I do. Well, my French is not a B, it's a second A language. But there are people who do CB, a lot of people, and it's perfectly acceptable. But you have to be able to do it at the right level. If, for example, your C is an average C and your B is not a very good B, if you combine the difficulties you have with your B and the difficulties you have with your C, it's too much. There are too many difficulties to make your product sufficiently good. So you shouldn't be doing it. So there's no shame at all in not offering CB. You may, in fact, or may not be aware that in the AIIC, if you look at the AIIC website, for the last 5 years or so, AIIC members have had to specify each language pair that they interpret with. So before, everyone took it for granted that if you had a B, you worked into your B from your A and your C. And then AIIC realized that a lot of people didn't do a good job working from their C into their B. So now we are asked as AIIC members to specify what language pairs we are offering. And many people will not offer C into B, which is fine. Now, another thing that the AIIC handbook says that I do have an issue with, I don't agree with it, is that the book says it is acceptable to offer B only in consecutive interpreting and not simultaneous. Now, that's fine, but it means that your B is not really what I would call a B language, because saying I can interpret into my B, let's say it's English, into my English B, only in consecutive, what does that mean? What are you saying when you say that? You're saying, I can only find the words, the correct words, and the correct register, and the correct nuances if I have time to think about it. Because obviously in consecutive, we have time. In simultaneous, we don't. And I would say to you that if that's the case, your English is not really a B language, because a B language has to be available and it has to be ready at speed when you're under pressure. Speaking English perfectly outside the booth has no relevance to interpreting. What matters is how well do you speak it under pressure? How well do you speak it when you're on automatic pilot? How well do you speak it when you only have your reflexes left and you can't think about the grammar, the syntax, and the vocabulary? It has to be automated, just like your A languages. And we'll come to that all in a little while. So I would say a high level B, which I assume is what you're all aiming at, to distinguish yourself from people who are, let's say, mediocre interpreters. A high level B has to be active from your A and your C, but that can come later in your career. You don't have to start with that. You can start by doing just C, A, and A, B. Another facet of B language interpreting is this. Now, again, I don't know whether you're aware of this. If you're working at a high level government meeting, if you're working between two heads of state, for example, or two ministers, or you're working between two captains of industry, the interpreters only work into their B. Now, the reason for that is that to be the voice of a country, you have to have the nationality of that country. So let's say, for example, that I, who am French and English, I am working between the French president and the English prime minister, as I have done on many occasions, by the way. And you're sitting there and you're doing whispering or consecutive at a bilateral. If I am a British national, I can be the voice of the UK. If I'm a French national, I can be the voice of France, but I can't be the voice of the other country of which I am not a national, which means that both interpreters in this situation will work into their B from their A. It almost sounds illogical because you'd think, well, they probably don't work so well into their B as their A, but that's a matter of protocol and politics. And I don't know whether you've thought about this a great deal in your careers as interpreters or in your student careers, but when you're an interpreter, you're part of a big international game. And if you're an interpreter working for governments, working for international organizations, the OECD, the UN, the EU, NATO, the Council of Europe, the World Customs Organization, the Organization of American States, the State Department, and the opponent of that game. And part of that big international game is nationality. So that's where this comes in. Again, I hope it's clear. I can't follow the chat, so I don't know if people are asking questions. I can only see one chat so far. But by all means, store your questions up and we'll come to them. In fact, now we're getting on for nearly halfway through. I'm thinking maybe what we could do is stop at the end of this section, and then you can ask questions if you have any before we move on to the third section, which is about how to improve and work on your B language. Now, I hope that matches the desires of your teaching staff and the people who run the university. If it doesn't, tell me. But I'm thinking we could stop after the second section and have some questions and answers, then move into the third section. Is that acceptable? I hear nothing.
Yes,
so
Chris, Yes, that's fine.
Okay,
Chris.
right.
Thank you.
Okay.
Fine. Thank you.
Okay, now here we have, just to help us continue to define a B language, these are extracts from a PhD thesis on B languages. It was a thesis that was written by a teacher at the University of Mons in Belgium. And she says this: there appears to be a general consensus that the notion of a B language is somewhat blurry. If an interpreter is expected to be perfectly fluent in the B language, then apart from perhaps a slight foreign accent, how exactly does this language differ from the interpreter's A language? What criteria have to be met for a language to be considered as a B language? Are these criteria? So by the way to that is yes, they are. And I'll come to that in a second. The question which needs to be asked here is the following: how could the notion of a B language be redefined so that a more detailed and clearer description could be given of what a B language is, or at least what AIIC thinks it should be? However, redefining the B language in this way may prove to be extremely difficult, since there appear to be many different types of B languages. The word type here is used to refer to the different levels of language mastery that may come under the very broad heading of B language. These different types may be a result of the market reality, perhaps a result of the high demand for B language interpreting, which then puts pressure on interpreters to have a B language, which may then result in people sponsoring others to work in a B language before they are really ready to do so. Now, a concrete example of what she's talking about here is again at NATO. Now, you may or may not be aware that NATO works a lot, or used to work a lot, with Russia. It's all part of what NATO does. It's dialogue with Russia. Now, these days, it's not so frequent because, of course, we're cross with Russia because of the annexation of the Crimea. But for many, many, many years, we worked every day with Russia. And the interpreters we hired were all freelance interpreters. Now, you're probably aware that most Russian A interpreters outside Russia live in Paris. The reason being that when the revolution happened in 1917, the white Russians, the ones who were royalists, they fled to Paris because French was the language of the Russian court and had been for centuries. And so French and Russian were always very close. And so these people fled Russia in 1917, and they set themselves up in Paris, and their children and their grandchildren were raised in French, which means there are a lot of people in Paris, interpreters, who are very good active Russian French interpreters. So for many years, NATO hired these people and brought them from Paris to Brussels to work into Russian and then back into French with their retour or their B language. And then NATO changed its policy. NATO decided that they wanted the Russians who were interpreting Russian speakers at NATO to work back into English and not French, only English. The reason being that NATO, out of the 30 member countries, 27 tend to speak English, which means NATO wanted there to be a maximum number of delegates listening to direct interpretation from Russian into English. So we changed the rule. And suddenly, overnight, 3/4 of the Russian A, French B interpreters whom we had been employing for years suddenly discovered they had an English B. Not because they had an English B, but because the market required it. Otherwise, they'd get no work. So this shows you how market pressure can push interpreters into offering a language as a B that they don't really have as a B. And the result of this was a NATO, for example, that out of the 22 Russian interpreters whom we used to hire, we ended up only hiring 6 because all the others hadn't really got an English B, but they all said they had. And this whole question here of the different types of B language, the different levels of B language, is a very big problem in our profession. We'll look at that in a second, because you have A and you have B and you have C. C is quite clear. A is reasonably clear, but B is not clear at all. And we'll come to that, I think, now. That's probably the next thing. Yes. I call this the B language continuum, trying to get a handle on what a B language actually is. What does it have to be to qualify as a B language? So this is just a graphic representation that I created myself to show how the B language continuum sort of works. So at the top of the language tree, we have the A language, which normally is your mother tongue. Not always, it may not be. It might be another language. I have a colleague at NATO who has an A language that is not the language of either of her parents. She is half Japanese and half English, but throughout her life, she was raised in the Lycée Français, in the French schools, wherever her parents happened to be living. So her first language is French, but neither of her parents has French as a first language. But generally speaking, it is the mother tongue. Now, I don't know whether this is a problem in Argentina. It probably isn't, because you're perhaps further removed from the center of Europe, where a lot of people speak different languages. But in Belgium and France and the UK, there are increasing numbers now of students in the schools where I teach who are alingual, who don't actually have a mother tongue. They don't have an A language. And the problem with that is that you can't really be an interpreter without an A language. Some of them are double B plus, some of them are double B minus. And that is a problem. It's because in Europe, there's so much movement. People move around so much, at least in normal times, that the children have 2 or 3 very good languages, but none of them is really an A language. I actually had that this morning. I was teaching this morning a young girl, and she went to an English-speaking school. So her English is very good, her French is very good, and her Russian is very good, but none of them is actually a proper, pure A language. And that is a problem. But anyway, apart from those situations, the A is normally quite clear. The C language is usually quite clear as well. I mean, in my particular case, I can speak from my own personal experience. My Spanish is a C. My Spanish is nowhere near as good as my English or my French, not even close, not in the same ballpark. And I wouldn't dream of interpreting into Spanish. I couldn't. I mean, I just couldn't find the words. I make too many mistakes. My accent is too poor. It would be ridiculous to do from Spanish. So it's a very clear C. That's not a problem. Now we move into this bit here. This is the complicated bit. This is the B language continuum. Now, because your B language can start just here, just above a C language, and it can end just below an A language. And all these are called B languages. Now, there's a movement within AIIC, and I personally am very much in favor of this movement, to reclassify B as B plus and B minus, or B1 and B2. But it's not going to happen. It'll never happen, because there are too many members of AIIC who stand to lose by a recategorizing of the B languages. It's not going to happen, but it's a good idea. So to come back to the continuum, let's say you're working on your C language and you decide you want to make it into a B. There will come a time when you will move from here, with my cursor gone, from here to here. And then you can start to say, yes, this is a B language. And you can satisfy clients in the private market at the entry level, the lowest level of demand. And you can do non-conference interpreting, public service interpreting, or social service interpreting. I'm not sure what you call it in Argentina. Not really pure conference interpreting, and that's fine. Then you continue to work on your B language. You work hard, you implement all sorts of strategies, including the ones we're going to talk about later, and you move your B language to here. And then you can start working for the mid-level private market, lobbies, big lobbies, like in Brussels, there are quite a few of those, and smaller international organizations, such as, for example, in Paris, there's the Railways Union. It's an international organization, but it's not as demanding as the UN, for example. Then if you continue to improve your B language, you might get up here. And then you can work for the most demanding employers, the big international organizations, government bilateral meetings, and the highest level private market. Now here, of course, just like any other part of the interpreting market, the expectations the customers have are very high. People are very demanding, but the pay is better. Yeah, because obviously if you do a good piece of work in any field of human endeavor, you get paid more for it. That's the way it works. It's natural. But your B language will never be able to get up here because, of course, a B language is not a mother tongue. And a B language doesn't have to be a mother tongue. So if any of you are worried because you think your second language, probably English, is not as good as your Spanish, of course it's not. It's not supposed to be, because you cannot make an A language. You have it or you don't, but you can make a B language. And that is the good news, because like I was saying at the beginning of this talk, as long as you're properly advised and you have good teachers and good coaches, there's no reason why any of you can't build a B language. The only thing that might stop you is that it's not cost effective. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Yeah, it may not be a cost effective use of your time to decide you want to make this or that language into a B. I have another way of showing the B language continuum, which is here. This looks even more complicated. So let's start at the bottom. So you can work, let's take, for example, I can see Eliana on the screen. Hi, Eliana. Are you hearing me? Okay, I can see someone called Eliana anyway. Eliana Patricia Heinrich. I can see her. So I'm going to say, let's take her as an example. And she has Spanish A, English B, French C, for example. So she can work from her English into her Spanish, and she can work from her French into her Spanish, but she doesn't work from her French into her English, and she only offers Spanish, English in consecutive. So she can offer quite a lot to her employer, but not everything. Then you move up here. Eliana continues to work on her Spanish, on her English, I beg your pardon, and she starts to be able to do all this. She can do Spanish, English, English, Spanish in simultaneous and consecutive, and she can do French, Spanish. The only thing she can't do is French, whoops, beg your pardon, is French, English. Then she gets better again, and she can do all the same things, but she can do French, English, but only in consecutive, not simultaneous. Then, after 15 years of hard work, she moves up to here, and she can do what we call a full booth. A full booth means that you can work from any of your languages, any active language into any other active language, and any passive language you have into any of your active languages. So in this case, Eliana can do Spanish, English, English, Spanish, French, Spanish, and French, English in both consecutive and simultaneous. So if you like, it's the full 9 yards, the full fat experience. And of course here, you're offering much more to your employer than you are here. These are all interpreters working with a B language, but this is better than this is better than this, and this is better than this. So it makes you more attractive to your employer, and therefore it's only not normal that you get better remuneration, and you're also deemed to be a better interpreter because you can offer more combinations and do more work. In some ways, it's purely mathematical. Okay, let's be clear on one thing. Yes, I don't think I need to say this. Obviously, you're not going to work into a C. Now, I don't know, again, I don't know the reality of the market in Argentina. I know, for example, in Mexico, that a lot of people work into a C. A lot of people will work in all their different languages, whatever their level of language mastery. But if you want to be a proper professional interpreter and provide a decent service to people who are paying you money, you can't do that. So I hope that none of you would work into a C, because you really shouldn't be doing that, not into a C, because it damages the whole profession to do so. Okay, Yes, we can continue with the second part of the class before we move to the questions and answers, and then we'll go into the third part by looking at a few B language characteristics and criteria. So what is typical? What is a typical specific criterion or characteristic of a B language? Okay, we don't need to think about that. Okay, now what happens when you're working with a B is that you don't have the natural intuition which you have with your A language. You have to concentrate. You can't speak a B language with the same fluidity, the same natural mastery as an A language. This is fairly obvious. But what compensates for that is that you have what we call the comprehension bonus working from your A. So if any of you here, most of you I assume are Spanish A, English B, when you work from Spanish into English, your English doesn't enable you to do the same things as your Spanish does. You have fewer words, it takes you longer to find the words, you may have a slight accent, you may have difficulty with register, you maybe have difficulty with humor. So it means you're more limited, but you understand the original, your Spanish, when you're doing Spanish English, really easily. So you can lay more stress on producing your B language. So, it swings and roundabouts, as we say in English. Then you have the question of an accent. Accent is a big problem in a B language. Do you know Inspector Clouseau in the Pink Panther films? Well, Inspector Clouseau has a very strong French accent. So this is one exchange from one of the films. Yeah, good. He comes into the hotel and says, "Do you have a room?" And they say, "I do not know what a room is." It's a room. So this is just a funny example of the fact that his accent was simply too poor to be understood. Now, most of you, I assume, are Spanish A's, 2 years at NATO, and having worked with lots of Spaniards, the Spanish they're not the most natural English speakers. Usually the Spanish accent is difficult for an Anglophone to understand. And there are many sounds in Spanish that simply aren't made in English. For example, at NATO, for many years, we had the chairman of the budget committee at NATO, who was a Spaniard. And the budget committee, as you might guess, at NATO is a big deal because NATO has billions and billions of euros as a budget. It's a massive organization. And you would think it would be important for the head of the budget committee to have good English. But he didn't really. For example, he couldn't pronounce the word budget. And he had his job for 5 years. And from the first day to the last day, he could not pronounce budget. He said, boye. We look at the boye. Now, I'm not saying that Argentinians are the same, but he was a Spaniard and he couldn't pronounce the word budget. And this was a problem. Had he been an interpreter, it wouldn't have worked because it was not comprehensible. So this is the problem. The French are very bad too. The French, this is a Frenchman here on this example, they have terrible accent in English. So the accent itself can be a problem. Now, it's very complicated to try and understand what the effect of a foreign accent is. So what I've put here is a slight foreign accent in your B language is not a problem as long as it doesn't damage comprehension. If it starts to damage comprehension, then it's a problem. Now, take, for example, a problem for a Spaniard, an Italian, or a French national speaking English. The word live and the word leave. Live is vivir, and leave is dejar, or salir. And if you pronounce live like leave, as the Spaniards and the Italians and the French tend to do, it means something different. So if you say, I want to live, you don't want to die. But if you pronounce it, I want to leave, you're telling people you want to go somewhere else. And that is a big problem. And so that sort of accent problem can be difficult. If you take as you know, in plural words. So if I say the best flowers are daffodils in English, that's a phrase that it's easy to understand. The best flowers are daffodils. But a French person speaking English will tend not to pronounce the last S. So they'll say the best flower are daffodils. Now, the minute I hear that as an English speaker, I think, well, what's that mean? Because a flower is singular and the verb here is plural. So did I miss something? Have I missed, did I not get the memo about what's going on here? So that's a typical example. So that's an example where the accent hampers comprehension. Another good example, it's one that people talk about a lot in the EU, because you hear lots of people speaking on behalf of the EU who are foreign language speakers speaking English. The word idea. Now, the word idea, I have an idea, I have a good idea or a bad idea. In English, it's pronounced idea. And the French pronounce it ID because they can't pronounce it correctly. So you may have a European Commissioner who will stand up and say, the European Commission has a new ID as regards migration. Now, I don't know what that means, because to me, a new ID is it's not an idea. So again, it's just example of how bad accent can hamper comprehension. It's hard to work on too. Accent is very difficult to I have a terrible accent in Spanish.
We lost him, I think. So let's wait for Chris to reconnect. He was having a terrible connection. Can you see him, Norma? Is Chris here?
Chris?
Because I can see his screen, but
we can see the screen, but I can't see him.
No. Yeah, but he's here. He's in the session.
Chris,
okay,
can you
hear me now? Are you now? No, you can't hear me? Are you hearing me as well or not?
You.
I can hear you. Yes, I can. Can you hear?
We lost you. We lost you.
Are you hearing me? Is it okay?
I think we lost you for a few minutes, but yeah, we were here right on this slide. So this is where we lost you. You were giving the examples.
Okay.
With the idea.
Is it okay now? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Good. Oof, that's a bit scary. So I was talking about foreign accent. Okay, hamper is that sometimes a foreign accent can actually be an advantage. It's not always a bad thing. Now, take an example. If you look at the surveys that have been carried out by organizations among their consumers interpreting, many of them that have done these surveys. Now, as the OECD, AIIC has, Ski Castle has, and the people who answer these surveys, they say that what really matters to them is accuracy and the right terminology. That's their number one consideration. The number two consideration among consumers of interpreting is consistency, i.e. the same vocabulary all the time. So the same concept is translated in the same way, consistency. They also are very keen on voice quality, good voice quality and a good natural delivery. So these are the things that delegates really like. And they don't.
Again.
Creo que la conexión,
Sí, es muy
decía el
bajo.
ancho de banda, no estaba...
Ahí lo veo otra vez. Ahí lo veo. Estás con el micrófono. You're muted, Chris. So let's see. But I can see him right now.
So this time I've changed my connection and I've moved to Wi-Fi rather than cable because the cable sometimes can pose a problem. Are you hearing me now?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Is it, yeah, okay. So let's see whether Wi-Fi is better than the cable this time. I hope it is. So I was saying that these are the things that delegates find important, not necessarily the accent. If you take the BBC example, a good example of how English is spoken in the world, when they have a foreign national, let's say, for example, they talk about Nabil Boukele, who had this very famous speech at the UN when he did a selfie, and they're doing the UN being out of date, and the fact it needs to be reformed. It was a very interesting speech. Somebody simulating a Spanish accent as Nabil Boukele, rather than somebody speaking proper English, completely normal English, because the audience find it more credible to have somebody with a foreign accent representing somebody who isn't an English speaker. So that means, to an extent, if you speak your B language with a slight foreign accent, with a slight accent, people will be more ready to believe you than they would if you spoke perfect English. The reason is that people who are not linguists, if they hear someone speaking English, let's say, for example, like me, I probably sound like a proper English speaker. At least I hope I do. And it would not occur to the average delegate that I also speak French just as well. If they hear me speaking like this, they think, oh, he must be English, therefore his French is probably good, but it can't be that good. So if I speak like this and I start to speak a little bit with a French accent, they will assume that I'm French, and therefore they will think, well, his French must be very good. So obviously he understands French, but his English is not perfect. So it's actually illogical in some ways, but it's also, you can understand it. So having a slight foreign accent in your B language is not a problem. If it's a big accent, it needs to be improved. And there's shadowing. Now, I don't know whether shadowing is part of what you do at the school in Buenos Aires. To me, it's a very important tool. I have my students shadow a lot in their B language. I also have them do reading exercises, and I have them do shadowing. So that if they hear a sound they don't understand in English, they know what that sound is meant to represent. And again, if you go onto the website of the Cambridge Conference Interpretation course that I gave you, one of the articles is about shadowing, very important tool. So we're still here we're looking at the language. So we've done accent. Now, number of errors. Now, errors, you cannot possibly quantify errors. These are the wonders of remote interpreting. Hello.
Hello.
Am I audible? Can you hear me?
Yeah, not
I
very
suppose we are
well.
a long way away. Yeah. Is it
Yeah.
okay? Am I coming through? Can you hear me? No?
We can hear you now.
Okay. Let me try Wi-Fi. Let me try moving a bit closer to my Wi-Fi source.
Okay.
Okay. I wonder if I shouldn't try moving a bit closer to my Wi-Fi source. I will try that. Forgive me.
Oh, that's
It's
fine.
very annoying when this happens, but it does tend to happen sometimes. Right. I'm now sitting nice and close to my Wi-Fi. How's that? Are you hearing me?
Let's try. Let's try.
Are you hearing me?
We can hear you now. Yes.
So tell me you're hearing me. Hello. Is this working?
Yeah.
Yes, I think it
I
is.
can't hear.
Yeah.
I think you can't hear us.
Okay. All right. Okay. Good. Let's hope it continues to work. Like I was saying, I suppose we are on. I'm trying to talk about mistakes now. Now, mistakes are really. Okay, I'm going to try something else. I'm going to try. I'm doing a Wi-Fi hotspot for my phone. Are you hearing me now?
Yes.
Okay, so
Yes.
I'll do a Wi-Fi. I'll do a Wi-Fi hotspot with my phone. See if that improves things.
Okay.
Right. Yeah, we'll wait. No problem.
It won't take a second.
Now that's fine. It's just that the network bandwidth is low.
Okay,
but
here we go.
No problem.
Well, I'm changing connection now. I'm using a mobile hotspot. So give me 1 second to get that set up. And with any luck, that will be better. Wait 1 second for me. Okay, now we go. Right, where are we now? Here we are. Can someone tell me you're hearing me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Okay. Right. This time I've tried. I said a hotspot from my phone, which we may hope is going to work better. Right. Moving on. Where was I now? Yeah, mistakes. So to give you an example about mistakes, I ran the test system at NATO for a long time, and NATO is extremely demanding. We have very high standards, and we don't accept a bad B language at all. But our test would last half an hour. So you'll be interpreting half an hour into a quarter of an hour into your B and a quarter of an hour into your A. And if during the quarter of an hour you were interpreting into your B in simultaneous, you made half a dozen mistakes in syntax or grammar, that would be about the maximum amount we tolerate. So about half a dozen mistakes in a quarter of an hour of simultaneous. It's not a lot. This is independent of language, of accent. This is actually mistakes in syntax and grammar. So it's to give you an idea, but it's not necessarily a particularly fair measurement, because NATO is the most demanding employer in the world, pretty much. We're extremely demanding. So yeah, you can make more mistakes than that at other levels, but just to give you an idea of the highest level. The OECD is about the same. The UN is about the same. They apply more or less the same standards. The difficulty at NATO and the OECD is that they are both bilingual or biactive organizations. Whereas at the UN, you've only got to be that good in one language. So that's to give you an example. Now, let me come to another facet of B languages. I mentioned earlier that we have this rise in today's world of Globish. And if everybody in a meeting room is speaking bad English, very frequently, the only person in that meeting who's going to speak proper English is the interpreter. Now, if you're in English A, that shouldn't be too much of a problem because obviously your English is going to be good. If you're in English B, it has to be good because the ideal thing is that you're being heard by the other delegates. They're listening to your English and saying, oh, that's how you say it. That's the expression I should be using. And so by speaking correct English in your English B, you can actually raise the level of the entire debate in the room because they're going to take you as an example. So it's really, really important, especially with an English B, primarily an English B, that you be an example to be followed. We have an expression in English which says a rising tide floats all boats. So if you raise the tide of the level of the English, all the boats are raised up. There's another factor which you have to bear in mind. I'm sure you know this already, and this may be in some ways is the major consideration of the whole briefing. Listening to a B language for a customer who's sitting in the room and has paid money for the interpretation is always more tiring than listening to an A language, always, without exception. Which means that basically you're asking your customer to do more work than they would if they were listening to an interpreter using their A language. So it's always going to be slightly less good, always, inevitably. And the question arises, when does it reach the point when it's not good enough? So you need to bear that in mind. The less good your B is, the more you're basically asking the customer to do some of your work for you, because your work consists as an interpreter of delivering good ideas clearly and nicely expressed to the ear of the customer. And if you can't do that perfectly, which you can't in a B, to an extent, you're always asking them to go some way to meet you and compensate for your failings. And that, if you like, is inherent to B language interpreting. But of course, it is accepted in the interpreting world. And somebody who works well and intelligently into a B language, and we'll talk about what that means in a minute, is better than somebody who works badly with an A. It's all a matter of, of adding all the difficulties together. Mm-hmm. Very frequently, I say to my students, most of whom are French A and English B, that English is a very complex language. I have a whole other briefing, a whole other masterclass on how to master the complexities of English, why English is a complicated language. It relies on pause, accentuation, tonic accent, emphasis, irony, sarcasm. Very frequently an English speaker will say the opposite of what they actually mean. And the meaning is in the tone, it's not in the words. So English is a very complex language. It's quite easy to speak English badly, but it's really hard to speak English well. If we had more time, I would have you do exercises tonight involving reading English, pausing at the right time, giving the accentuation, but we don't have time for that tonight or this afternoon. And so what I'm saying is that my French A, English B students, very frequently I listen to them working into their B, and there's nothing that's actually terrible. There's nothing which is completely wrong, but everything is slightly wrong. And if everything is slightly wrong, it just becomes a complete nightmare to listen to for an English A customer. And they'd rather not listen. They're just not going to bother. They'll put the headphones down and say, I can't listen to that. But it's not one single thing you can point to which is completely wrong. It's just that everything is slightly off. It's the music of the English. English has a great deal of musicality. Well, Spanish does too, of course. French doesn't. French is much more monotone. But English goes up and it goes down, and you wait and you pause and you give accentuation and emphasis, and then you have irony and you have a questioning tone. English is a very onomatopoeic language. And that's why learning to speak it naturally is very hard for a non-native speaker. Anyway, let's move on a bit. To talk about the difference between a B and an A, you know, I was saying that with a B, you're always asking your customers to do some of the work for you. The standard way of putting that is this: in our native language, we say what we want. In an acquired language, we say what we can, because we are limited and we cannot say everything that we understand. So that is just goes to this is an extract from the film Hannah Arendt, the famous violinist. Hannah Arendt speaking English is like she is playing the fiddle. If you want to hear her play the Stradivarius, you should learn German. Nelson Mandela said, if you talk to a man in a language he understands, that goes to his head. If you talk to him in his own language, that goes to his heart. And it can be hard to touch people's hearts when you're speaking a foreign language. It's possible, but it's hard. And it requires a great deal of investment. And you have to love the language. You have to want to speak it with your gut and with your soul, and not just speak it with your lips, because that is not what a language is. Okay. Done that. We've mentioned that already, the fact that you can create a B language, which is the good news, which is what you're doing. Now, before we move on to the last part of the briefing, do you want to have a short time for questions and answers, and maybe people can go and have a technical break and a glass of water? We could perhaps give it a 5-minute pause now, but I'm happy to answer questions now, if there are any.
Well, if there are any questions, you can either write them in the chat for Chris. In the meantime, Chris, I have just something that caught my attention while listening to your presentation. You said continue to improve your B language. I think that the B language is something that you never, ever stop improving. There are many students actually here in this meeting, and I think that one of the most important things for them is just to realize that the basic part of the training is to acquire the techniques, consecutive, note-taking, simultaneous. These are the basic techniques of interpretation. But then there is all this issue about the language and how the B language should be used in interpreting. And that is something that never stops. I think that work on accent and improve the B language in the syntax, grammar, register, this is something that they should concentrate on after acquiring the basic training and the basic techniques of interpretation. Don't you think so?
Yeah, well, I think that's probably true for all of interpreting anyway. One of the great things about our profession, which I love personally, and maybe I should have said to the students, if most of you are at the beginning of your careers, it's a fantastic job. It's a massive challenge. It's always a challenge. I've done it for 32 years, and I still love to go in the booth very much. And you can never say, I've done it, it's done, I finished, I've got where I need to be, because you never do. It's a constantly work in progress. And that holds true for every technique, and it holds true for the B language very much. And there is no, especially if your B language is English, because it's such a complex language. Everyone thinks it's an easy language, but it's actually very complex, really complex.
Yes, because actually what we find is that the problem, the basic problem between English and Spanish, well, any language, but Spanish, especially in our case, is just working on into English and as the B language is the transcodings of the syntax and the grammar of Spanish into English. And actually, the key thing here is to improve the B language as in English in such a way that it doesn't sound English with Spanish grammar and syntax. And that's the key. That's the key point, actually, and the most difficult thing.
It's funny actually, Norma, because the more I teach and the longer I've been an interpreter, the more I'm very keen on deverbalizing.
Yeah, that's right.
Because I get so fed up with my students giving me French with English words rather than English.
English, that's right.
What I always try and say to my students is, listen to the idea, okay, you've got the idea. Now, how do you express that idea in the other language, rather than saying, how do I translate this word into the nearest word in the other language?
In the other language, that's right. And copy the structures.
Yeah. Otherwise, it just sounds like French or Spanish with English words, and that isn't English.
That's right. And the problem comes when the accent is not that good. Then you have the Spanish grammar and syntax with a sort of bad or not very good English accent. And that's not that good for delegates listening to English, native.
And very frequently, delegates will not actually analyze why they find a certain B language interpretation difficult to listen to. It's not their job to analyze it.
No,
but they will just say it's tiring. I don't like listening to it. It's too tiring, because what they're doing is having to slightly correct every single expression, slightly, just by 1 or 2%, and it ends up being quite a tiring exercise for the customers. So if there aren't any questions, we can move on to the third part, or it's entirely up to you. I can't see anybody.
Would you like to take a break, a very short break, 5 minutes, 10-minute break?
Okay, 5 minutes is good. Yeah, 5 minutes. So
5 minutes.
Shall we? What time do you want to come back? At 12:30 or 32 or?
Yeah.
12:30. Okay.
5 minutes. Yep, that's right.
Okay. See you in 5 minutes.
In 5 minutes. Thank you. Hi, Chris. We are back.
Hi, I'm back too. We're all back. Some of us
We are all
anyway.
back. Actually,
Okay.
can you see the chat? There are a couple of questions. There are a couple of questions in the chat.
Okay. Yeah. From Clara, how do you think virtual classes have affected interpreter training courses as opposed to in-person classes? Do you see any prominent pros or cons on each type? Well, yes, I do. I mean, I've been teaching all this year in remote as well. Most of my classes have been in RSI. It actually is not as bad as I thought it would be. I find that the students, my students who have been through a year of training online haven't actually suffered as much as I thought they might. And the results they're achieving are pretty much as good as usual, which I'm quite impressed by and pleased by. I do find that teaching simultaneous remotely is hard. I tend to use a platform called Watch Together. I don't know whether you use Zoom with interpreting and you use the interpreting function. I know it's another option. Yeah, it makes it more complex, and it also means that consecutive, for example, I find consecutive harder to teach as well, because you don't really get a handle on the full body language that the student is using, because all you're seeing basically is the head and shoulders. And to me, interpreting, especially consecutive interpreting, involves a lot of body language. And we like also to look at our students from the minute they stand up to go and interpret. They stand at the podium, then they walk back again, and all of that. Yeah, we call it the perp walk. I don't know if you know the expression, the perp walk. Yeah, because delegates are watching you doing all this in the real world. They're watching every part of your behavior, and that you can't legislate for so much in remote interpreting. I think for you who are students, maybe in your second year of your master's program this year, you don't have to worry as much as we might have thought, because you haven't suffered as much as one might have expected. That being said, you suffer from bad sound. Of course, it makes interpreting harder. I say working at NATO, we work mostly in person, mostly in hubs. We're lucky not to have to do a great deal of remote interpreting. I've done a lot of remote interpreting for charities, and it's almost always less good because the sound quality is compressed. There are no platforms. I don't know whether you have much experience of all the major interpreting platforms. I have experience of all of them, and there are none of them that actually comply with all the ISO standards for sound quality. So it's always harder. It always requires more mental effort. There's a bigger cerebral load with RSI, which means that you tend to have to interpret for shorter times. And of course, there can be acoustic shock, which is difficult to manage. A lot of interpreters in the EU, for example, are off sick because of acoustic shock. And you have two things. You have acoustic shock, which is a peak in sound. It can damage the hearing. And then you have constant poor quality sound that isn't just a one-off thing. It's a constant degradation of the sound. And that also simply creates a big cognitive load. So that's part, if you're learning to interpret on a remote platform, there is that extra facet. That being said, the world that you're moving into, you young interpreters, is going to be partly composed of RSI forever. It's not going to go away.
Yeah.
Many of my students, in fact, who have graduated this year or the year before, have only ever interpreted online. It's all they've ever known.
No, it's true.
Which means there's been what we call a sea change. I don't know if you know the term of sea change. Comes from Shakespeare, by the way. I also teach a lot of Shakespeare. There's been a sea change in our profession. It really has, and it's never going to go back completely.
Yeah.
Now there are good sides to it and bad sides to it, because some people who have children, for example, they can work from home. It's easier. They haven't got to do public transport. They haven't got to waste time moving around. But there are pros and cons. Let's move to another question on the chat from Ornella Vanina. If we don't have a C language, but we want to learn one, e.g. French, is it good advice to do it while mastering the B language, or maybe it's too confusing? Yes. I wouldn't say it's too confusing, but I would say that as a young interpreter, I'm assuming, Ornella, that you must be about 10 years old, like the other people I can see on the screen. It's best to do one thing at a time as an interpreter. Work on a B or add a C. Don't do both at the same time, it's just too much. The French have a saying, qui trop embrasse mal étreint. If you embrace too many things, you can't love any of them.
That's true.
And it's just too much. I think as a young interpreter, you've got a mountain to climb. Learning to interpret is a very, very complex procedure. It can take an entire lifetime. But making a C into a B, for example, or improving a B, and at the same time adding a C is just too much. And then also, if you do that, your A language will also suffer. And a lot of my students, in fact, I had a class this evening before I came to speak to you with a student of mine who is taken the NATO interpreting test very shortly. And we've been working a lot on her B language, but as we found out tonight, because of that, her A language has suffered. So you've always got to keep these things in balance all the time, work on all the facets of your language combination, and doing two things at once is just too much. So I'd say either go for learning a B or improving a B or adding a C, but not both. And I would say make a decision depending upon your language profile, the market you're aiming at. You need to be very clear about where do you want to work? Who do you want to work for? What does that market require? What does that market ask for? And interpreting is like anything else. You have to offer what the world wants. If the world wants an English B, well, that might be the right path to go down. So answer, you'll know a short answer, don't do both. Too much. Juan Cano, he was trying to explain the BBC English as a standard. Excuse me, I could not understand the concept because he was unstable. Yes, well, yes. No, I was simply saying, Juan, I was simply saying that the BBC as an example. Yeah, it's an example because they tend to represent the English language worldwide. It could be Voice of America. It could be public broadcasting in America, NPR, National Public Radio. They are canons of the English language. And all I was saying was that the BBC, when they are representing a foreign national, they will often use an actor simulating the accent of that person's nationality to make it sound more authentic. So what I was saying to you is that if you have a foreign accent in English, it can be a plus, not necessarily a minus. And I also went on to add that if you look at the surveys that have been carried out among consumers of interpreting, most consumers don't find the foreign accent the big problem. It's not that so much. Okay, last question on the chat, I think, is from Jason. That sounds like a non-Spanish name. Do most NATO OECD level interpreters have B languages that are significantly less good in their language? Are there differences subtle enough that only trained ear could notice? That's a very good question, Jason. And the answer is that I can speak for NATO, obviously, because I know NATO extremely well. Generally speaking, I would say that the gap between your B and your A can't be greater than about 15%. That in itself means nothing really, because yeah, you have accent, you have vocabulary, you have knowledge of the culture, you have a lot of things which go into making your B a good B or a bad B, a lot of things. But generally speaking, if you have to put a figure on it, I would say if there's more than a 15% difference, then that's too much. Whereas on a private market, if I take the Brussels or Paris private markets that I know very well, that can be 40% or even maybe 50%, the difference. But again, as we say in English, it's horses for courses. But the short answer, Jason, asking because of the bidirectionality issue. Yeah, of course. One of the difficulties in working for NATO or the OECD or the Council of Europe is that you have to be good in 2 languages, not just one, which is why not everybody works for NATO or the OECD. But if you can bring your B language up to a level where it's almost as good as your A, that's what we're aiming at. And of course, we prefer people who are bilingual, totally bilingual, obviously. But those sort of people aren't that common. Shall we move on to the third part of the talk now?
Yeah,
okay.
Please.
This is the part. Yeah, this is the part that my wife always says is the most important part, because it actually gives you practical tips on what to do. It isn't just philosophizing. So how do we acquire or improve a second active language? I have a number of strategies for you. I would say there are certain essential preconditions if you want to acquire a B language, and they are the ones on the screen here. The first one is your A language has to be excellent, because if you're still working on your A language, forget about the B language. The reason being that you can be an interpreter without a B. You can earn a living without a B, but you can't be an interpreter without an A. So until you've reached a proper professional standard in your A language, don't even think about the B language. And now I appreciate maybe in your school you do both at the same time. I mean, that's fair enough. You've only got 1 year or 2 years. So obviously you can't do one and then the other, but you have to have a good level of A language interpreting. Otherwise, working on the B is simply going to distract from your main tool, which is the A. The next thing I'd say is that the language you want to make into a B language has to be very good. Yeah. It may be theoretically possible, for example, for me to make my Spanish into a B. Perhaps I could do it, but is there any point? It would take me 10 years. And in those 10 years, I have to earn a living and eat. So is it a reasonable ambition for me? No, it's not. But I'm not saying it's not possible, it's just not reasonable. So bear that in mind. Is your English, if you want to make your English into a B, how good is it? How bad is your accent? How good is your accent? How much do you know the culture? In the US or the UK, you have to know the culture, because the language is a reflection of the culture. The language doesn't exist in a void. It's not words. It's a reflection of how people live their lives, how they see the world, their history, and you have to know the culture. If you don't know the culture, you can't really use that language as a B, because there's no basis behind it. That's why this is another criterion I would say you have to fulfill. You need to have lived in the country where that language is the lingua franca for some time. 9 months, 12 months. If you take, for example, the Paris schools, ESIT and ISIT, which are often held to be among the best schools in the world, and you take the FTI in Geneva, they are often held up to be the 3 best schools. With all respect to your school, which I don't know, I'm sure it's just as good. But they require that you prove that you've lived for a year in the country of your B. And they're quite right, because it's very hard to speak convincingly in a foreign language unless you know the culture behind the language. It's not impossible, it's just very hard. I do know people who have a very good B and learned it entirely from TV and films. So it is possible, it's just harder. And the last thing here, these two go together. These two are very important. Don't think that you can learn to interpret into an A and then say, okay, I'm now going to apply all that to my B, and now I have a B. No, you don't. You have to actually replicate a good part of the training you went through initially into your A. You have to replicate it into your B. The reason being, I put here, your brain changes shape. That was the name of a program about interpreters' brains. You have to establish neuronal pathways. So for each language combination that you use as an interpreter, your brain has to adapt to be able to facilitate that work. And it requires physically your brain creating synapses and neuronal pathways that don't actually exist until you practice. So you have to put those pathways in your brain in place, and it simply takes time. You cannot do it overnight. It takes practice. And a lot of what you did initially, you have to redo working into a B. Not all of it, but a lot of it. So it takes hard work and commitment and time. Now, let's look at what forms the training might take to improve your B. The first learning strategy, which I put as number 1, because to me it is the most important, is to shadow. Now, I don't know whether your school uses shadowing. Some schools don't use it very much. I think it's a massively useful tool.
Yeah, we do use it. We do use it. Yeah,
that's good to hear. But I know some schools don't actually, which I think is a mistake. Shadow native speakers, choose which ones. Let's say, for example, you want to have an English B. Is it going to be American or British? You've got to make a choice. You can't be in the middle. So you make your choice. I'm assuming for Argentinian, it's probably going to be Yankee, because that's nearer the culture you're in. I'm assuming. Obviously, I prefer British English. My wife is American, and we have lots of arguments about which English is better. Is it American or British? And of course, it's British. But anyway, choose one of them. And don't think it's an anodyne choice. If I say to you, for example, I'm in a meeting, right? I'm sitting in a meeting and say, Mr. Chairman, can I have the floor? And the chairman says, yes, please go ahead. I would like to table this motion. Now, what do I mean by that? Or allow me to table this question. Now, if I'm Brit, it means I want to put the question on the table to have it discussed. If I'm American, it means the opposite. I want to take it off the table and put it away so we don't discuss it. Now, you have to know which it is. And your accent will, if you speak with an American accent in English and you use the English usage to table, then no one's going to understand what you're saying because they simply don't go together. So choose your language carefully. Are you going to say sidewalk or pavement? Because to an American, the pavement is where the cars drive. And to me as a Brit, the pavement is where people walk. And that can be a fairly serious mistake if you get those two wrong. For example, so you have to be able to have the right vocabulary to go with the accent. So when you're doing this, you're shadowing, you can experiment with different time lags. You can try a long time lag of 3 seconds, a short time lag of 1 second. You can introduce your own expressions gradually. You can say, I'm going to change 1 word per sentence, 2 words per sentence. I'm going to change every other word. So you make the speech increasingly your own. And then while you're doing that, you start to introduce multitasking exercises. I'll explain why in a second. And these can take the form of either a prearranged numerical progression. So while you're shadowing, you write down 3, 10, 17, 24, 31, 38, 45, 52, etc. Or you can write out the lyrics of a song or a poem that you know by heart, because you're not supposed to be learning it. Then you record yourself while you're interpreting, while you're shadowing. So you hear your shadowing. Does it sound good? Does it sound natural? And then you check for the accuracy of this bit here. Now, if both of them are there, then you're getting close to be able to work in that B. Now, the reason we do this is because if to work into a B language, you have to use all your mental resources, you can't do that because your mental resources have to be used for understanding the reasoning of the delegate, not saying, oh, how do I use that verb? What does the syntax say here? How do you pronounce this word? You can't be thinking that because you don't have enough bandwidth in your brain to do that and interpret correctly. So all this is pushing your brain into being able to speak English, let's say it's English, with only part of your attention. And then you can devote your major brain power to what you're paid for, which is actually understanding the reasoning and getting it across. The language is incidental. Until you can speak proper, again, let's say English, on autopilot, you can't interpret into that language as a B. I recall when I was in interpreting school, I was there for a year because in the UK, the interpreting master's degree is only 1 year. And I worked really, really, really hard on activating my French because I was in an English-speaking country. And I still remember the day when I did all this and it worked out, it was fine. I thought, yes, now I've reached the stage where I can actually start to interpret rather than just try and learn my B language. I hope it's clear. I hope you're understanding it. I'm not sure I'm making myself clear. I hope so. But you have to be able to speak your B language on autopilot. And it has to be at least correct in grammar, syntax, and preferably the accent has to be okay. Then you can start to actually interpret. Until then, you can't. And doing this will hurt. Trust me, it will hurt your brain. You'll want to give up. Your brain will say, stop, it's too much, I can't do all this. But that's why it takes time. Everything we learn in interpreting takes time. It's like running. It's like doing weightlifting. You do a little bit more each day, and then one day you reach your goal. But you can't do it from one day to the next. It takes time. Okay. Yes. Another consideration while you're thinking about working on your B is you need to be careful not to make the error that most people make. That is, they channel their energy into the quality of the language at the expense of the content. So when you're working into a B, your reflex should be the opposite. You should be thinking about the content primarily and the language secondarily. And you need to speak simple language. And we'll come to that in a second. Keep it simple, stupid, the KISS principle, KISS. Do not try too hard in your B language. Keep it simple, be humble, be reasonable, and lay more stress on the actual content than the containing. The French say the contenant and the contenu. The language is less important than the actual idea. Let me move on a little bit more and talk about some more stuff. This thing here, now, I don't know whether you've ever come across this model before. This is a cognitive model. When you're working from your B into your A, you're using, say, 70% of your effort to understand the language you're hearing, and 30% of effort into creating your own language. So this is your B, this is your English. 70% of your concentration is required to understand it. 30% is required to speak Spanish. It could be 90-10, it could be 80-20, but it's biased in that way. When you're working into your A, into your B, I beg your pardon, it's the opposite. You instinctively understand your native language. It may take only 5% of your effort, your mental effort, if it's easy to understand, if it's a simple speech. And you're devoting 3/4 of your effort to actually producing the language. I also like to speak about attire, the same thing, because you may or may not know that I'm a rally driver. I do car racing. In fact, I've just finished one. I'm about to do another one shortly. So in car racing, your car is connected to the road by tires, the 4 tires. Now, your tire, you can choose to accelerate or to brake or to corner with your tire. And you can divide those tasks up. You can brake and corner. You can accelerate and corner. But you can't do, but whatever you do, however you split the 3 tasks, which is listening and speaking and understanding, braking, accelerating and cornering, you cannot go beyond the limit of the tire. And your brain is your tire. So you can't go beyond your brain's limit, but you can, within the limit, you can split up the effort between listening and speaking and processing. And you can vary that effort depending upon the combination. But you have to respect the limit of your brain. But the limit of your brain can increase every day. You can increase it by that much every single day. And then within 6 months, you've increased it by this much. That's how the human brain works. And that's how an interpreter's brain works. Okay, let's move on to a second learning strategy for your B language. The identity which you have in your mother tongue and your vocabulary, the way in which you relate to the world in Spanish, in your case, I assume, comes mostly from your secondary schooling, between the ages of, say, 11 and 15, or 10 and 15. That's where you get most of your identity linguistically. But you didn't do that in your B language. You didn't go to school in your B language. Well, you may have, in that case, you're lucky. If you went to 2 different schools in 2 different countries, you're lucky enough, maybe you're AA, or maybe your B is very strong. But most people didn't do that. And so the most basic things which are part of your identity, like calculating in your head, counting, that sort of thing, the way in which you relate to the world, the way in which you remember how many months there are, how many days there are in each month. You probably have a rhyme which you learned in Spanish. I learned it in English and French. That's the way in which you identify with the outside world. And you don't have that in a B language. So you have to do it. You have to go back and learn it. And it's very often a useful technique to actually go to say an English bookshop and buy the secondary school books that school students use when they're 10 years old to learn about the world in English, because you don't have that. You have it in Spanish, but not in English. So you've got to replicate that, the thing you missed out on when you were teenagers. And a very good way, I say, can be to buy the books that the schools use in that country. You say, oh, that's how you do your times tables. 3 times 7 is 21, 4 7 is 28, 3 12 is 36. It's a thing that's ingrained in your identity in Spanish, but not in English. So you have to learn it. Go back to school, basically. Do you know mathematical concepts? Do you know mythology? Do you know, well, we'll come to that in a second. Okay, now, the fields in which your language knowledge will be lacking in a B, which you didn't get at school, are usually this. The number one is always this. You have to learn all the geography and geographical place names in English, because you cannot make them up. You know them or you don't know them, and you have to learn them. If you're interested, by the way, I have a sound file which I've done for my students here in Belgium and France, where I pronounce the name of every country in the world in English. If you want it, I can send it to you. Because you may not know how to pronounce the countries, and you cannot make them up. And that's why, for example, in the test at NATO, we put a lot of geographical names in, because we know people can't do them in a B language.
Yeah, that's right. That would be great. Thank you, Chris.
Okay.
That would be great.
I'll send it to you on my email.
Thank you.
The second important field which was lacking probably in your psyche in English is history of art. The third one, literature in general. The fourth one, mathematics. The fifth one, chemistry and physics. All the things you learned at school. How do you say all these things in English? All these basic things. You don't know. You have to learn it. But if you're going to do one, do this: geography and country names, mountain ranges, rivers, that sort of thing. How do you name them in English? You could put here with literature, you could put mythology. For example, I was doing a speech yesterday with a student of mine. It was a speech by the French Foreign Minister, Le Drian, and he used the phrase, how many of you have French here? Jouer les Cassandres. Jouer les Cassandres means playing at being Cassandra. Now, what did Cassandra do? Do you know how to say Cassandre in French and Cassandra in English? And do you know what it means? Because the French use that expression, the English don't. So, it's something which you have to learn as an example. Moving on. Oh yeah, another thing, for example, which you don't know probably in your B language are figures of speech. Like, for example, don't count your chickens till they're hatched. This is as rare as hen's teeth. You can take a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. All these dictums, these sayings, which I'm sure you have in Spanish, but you probably don't know them in English. And when you come across one when you're interpreting, you have to know the equivalent, or at least what it means. The first stage is to know what it means and just say what it means. The second stage is to actually be able to say it with an equivalent dictum in the other language, for example. Okay, moving on. Okay, you need to cover all the registers. Now, that's something which interpreters don't think about nearly enough, because generally speaking, when you're taught a B language in a school interpreting, they teach you the posh stuff, the Financial Times, the Economist, that sort of thing. They say, read the Economist, read the Financial Times. But most people who speak English don't do that. They read the Sun, they read the Express if they're in England. So you need to know that as well. You need to know all this. Here you have Le Monde in French, but you also need to know what normal people read, because normal people refer to their lives around them, and their lives don't tend to involve the Economist unless they're university teachers or economists. If you're a normal person speaking the English language, you don't read the Economist or the Financial Times. So you read the normal daily papers. So you need to do that. Now, here we have some good examples of pop culture. You cannot neglect pop culture in your B language, because you probably have a vague idea about all these things in Spanish, but again, not in English. How do you use all the terminology from Harry Potter, The Lord of the Rings, The Matrix, the Peanuts cartoon strip, Twilight, the film series, Star Wars, Star Trek? Do you know how all these things are spoken about in the English language? Here we have a film, for example, The Hunt for Red October. How do you say that Obviously in Spanish, you know, but did you know in English how to say it? These are sports teams, football teams, the Gunners, the Cop. That's Arsenal, the English team Arsenal. This is the Liverpool team. Supporters are called the Cop. All these things are part of the language and part of how English speakers speak about the world. And you have to know as much about them as you possibly can. Let me give you an example here, right? So this is pop culture, okay? Do not neglect it. Now here are examples that I've heard in the last 6 months in meetings at NATO. So the first one, if I say to you that, do you know what it means? Can you replicate that? Basically, it's a Star Trek holodeck. Do you follow Star Trek? Do you listen to it in English or in Spanish? If you do. The Star Trek holodeck, by the way, is the simulation deck where you go for rest and recreation, R&R. Do you know what R&R means in English? R&R means rest and recreation. It's a military term. So this was a fighter pilot trying to explain to his colleagues how the Americans use simulation to train their fighter pilots. And he was trying to explain it, and he said, well, it's complicated. Basically, just imagine the Star Trek holodeck. So you have to know what it means. You have to have seen Star Trek. Even if you don't like it, watch it for the purposes of working, of being an interpreter. This one here was a very interesting one. You may or may not know the Peanuts cartoon strip. It's very famous in America and also in the UK. And so this delegate was talking about Russia and the US. And he was saying that Russians keep changing the goalposts. They keep moving the goalposts. So you never know where you stand with Russia. And he was referring to the Peanuts cartoon strip where the girl continually, she puts the football down and the boy runs up to kick it and she removes it at the last minute and he falls flat on his back. And it's been happening for 20 years and he still doesn't learn that she's going to pull the ball away at the last minute. So that's what he was saying that Russia was doing with America. And so my colleague who was in the booth is a very clever man. He's read lots of literature, but he doesn't read Peanuts. And so he starts saying in French, it's like peanuts as in the nut, les cacahuètes. But of course, the delegates start looking around saying, why is it like peanuts, the nut, rather than peanuts, the comic strip? And I couldn't even save him because it's too complicated to explain. I couldn't write it all down. And so I actually walked out of the booth. It was too embarrassing. I couldn't take the pain because it was a car crash. And that was because, it's not because he was a bad interpreter, it was because he didn't care about pop culture because he thought it wasn't important, but it was. This one here, for example, do you understand what this one means? This is a delegate who was in the meeting and he was the only British delegate in the room. And so they wanted to draft an important statement. And so they were saying, can you just check that the English is correct? And so he says, don't look to me to check the drafting. I'm more My Fair Lady than anything else. My Fair Lady being a film, it's a film of the book of the play Pygmalion by George Bernard Shaw, where a language professor teaches a girl from the gutter to speak like a countess. So what he was saying is he's more like the girl in the gutter than the countess. And so there's no point in asking him to check the English. There's one more I wanted to refer you to. And now you may think you're not interested in pop culture. That's fair. I mean, that's fine. But you have to be interested in it for the purposes of your job. Now, a good example of this is Game of Thrones. My wife and I weren't interested in Game of Thrones at all. And then one day I was interpreting for President Obama, because obviously I work at NATO and Obama was the American president and I interpret for him. And he said at one time, he was making a speech and he said, Khaleesi is coming to Westeros. Now he was referring to Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton, who is a blonde, she is like Khaleesi in the Game of Thrones, who is a princess coming from abroad, coming to Westeros to claim the throne. So he was saying Hillary Clinton is going to win the election. And I didn't know what he meant because I didn't know Game of Thrones. So I looked it up and said, oh, it's Game of Thrones. I'm going to have to start watching Game of Thrones. So I did. I read the books. I watched the series, which I think is very good, by the way. It's an example of why you need pop culture. because Obama is a very erudite man. He's a very patrician politician, but he still quotes pop culture. Probably his daughters watch it. Okay, another strategy. This is a strategy that my wife is very keen on. You choose an outstanding speech in the target language. In English, for example, you could choose an Obama speech. His speeches are very good. Again, choose the version of the English language you want to speak, and then memorize one complete sentence per day. Not good morning or goodbye, but a complete sentence, okay? And you don't have to keep adding them together. You can memorize one, then forget it, and memorize another one. And you repeat it 100 times a day, 200 times a day. You repeat that sentence until it becomes complete second nature. But choose the most elegant speech you can find. If you need a list, I have a list I can send you of very good speeches to use for either shadowing or to use for this purpose in English. But somebody needs to remind me of what I've promised. So remind me tomorrow. Another learning strategy.
I will.
Okay, that's fine, Anna. So remind me. Another learning strategy is flexibility exercises. Now, you cannot interpret into English, for example, unless your English is really, really rich. And for any given idea, you have 3 or 4 versions which are accessible in your head. Because if you only have one version, you probably won't find it. If you bear in mind the fact that in simultaneous, when we're under stress, we lose between 30 and 50% of our ability because we're stressed, especially if we're a young interpreter. If you have 4 possible ways of interpreting any given expression, you might find one. If you have one way, you won't find it. So take a text, do on-site translation, and rather than just doing one version of each sentence, do 4 versions. 4 is reasonable in a B language, 7 is good in an A language. So if you're working English, Spanish, you should be able to give 7 versions immediately, not in half an hour. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, working into a B, 1, 2, 3, 4. And you change everything. You change the passive voice to active voice to passive voice, start at the middle, start at the end, use different vocabulary all the time, push yourself, push your brain into finding other ways to interpret that particular sentence. And you can make it into a game. You can do it in pairs or in teams and see who can get the most versions. Or you can work together. You can have 2 or 3 sitting there together, say we're going to find 10 versions of this sentence in English. And just do that. And it'll push your brain to think outside the box, to dig down into what you know, to activate your knowledge of that language. This is another basic one. Spend time in the country where the language is spoken and go and visit museums, exhibitions, sporting, cultural events, pick up the language, watch subtitles on films. That's how they say it. Next learning strategy, carry a notebook or a dictaphone, and every time you hear a good expression, a metaphor, an image, a quotation, a neologism, an impressive phrase, a cliche, write it down or record it and learn it. I still have my notebook that I used when I was interpreting students. I know all those things now, but I wrote hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them down. Now, to conclude, let's come to a few general considerations of things you should avoid doing in a B language. Generally speaking, each language has its own particular difficulties. We can talk about English. English is tonic accent. If, for example, tonic accent and stress. So if I say to sever, the verb to sever is to cut, right? But the adjective severe is something completely different. If I pronounce sever like severe or severe like sever, my English becomes completely incomprehensible. Another thing about English is the accentuation of words in a phrase. If I talk about the White House, what's the White House? It's where the American president has his office. If I talk about the White House, it's a house painted white. The other day I was teaching a student, and we were talking about, it was Obama again, he was talking about the problems they had when the British tried to burn down the White House in 1851. And my student said, when the English tried to burn down the White House. I said, which White House was that? Oh, you mean the White House? You see, English is a subtle language. If I talk about a blackbird or a black bird, what's the difference? A blackbird is a sort of bird. It's a particular type of bird in French, a merle. No idea what it is in Spanish. A black bird is simply a bird that is color black. So English is a very subtle language. And that's one of the, but the main problems in English is going to be the tonic accent. I have a very good poem. I'm not sure whether you know it. It's called The Chaos. In fact, if you like, I could just play it at the end if you've got 5 minutes. It's amazing. It's going to make you commit suicide because it shows you how impossible English is to get right. If you like, we can end with that. Okay. Pay great attention to register because you've got to get the register right. Now, the problem with the B language is that you don't understand the register. You don't understand where this or that word sits on the register between top and bottom. You know, where exactly is this word? If, for example, you're using a swear word, if you've got delegates who are swearing at each other, who get emotional, you know, where does that word sit? Is it here or is it here? Am I going to offend somebody, or am I going to do them a disservice because I'm not giving them enough emphasis? This an example I have here. We were carrying out a test at NATO of a Russian interpreter. And the test had gone very well. He's a very good interpreter. I know him well. He's experienced. He's got excellent English. He's a natural interpreter, very experienced. And this was the last speech. And the last speech in the test was an ambassador saying goodbye to his colleagues. This happens a lot in NATO. Ambassadors stay 3 or 4 years. They leave. They always make a goodbye speech. And it's always very elegant. And they always try and quote poetry. And you know, it's always quite difficult to do well. And in this speech, while he was interpreting from Russian into English, he said, and finally, guys, I want to say this. Now, you cannot say guys when speaking between ambassadors. You simply can't do it. And had we let him pass the test and put him in the booth, if he said that, he would have offended half the ambassadors of NATO or ministers, for example. And so he failed the test just because of one single word. Because we said to ourselves, he obviously has no idea of where the word guy sits in the register. Is it elegant? Is it inelegant? Is it informal? Is it formal? And it simply wasn't good enough. And it would have been too dangerous to let him work, especially with Russian, because the Russians are very sensitive about these things. So one word was enough. It should have been gentlemen, my dear friends, my distinguished colleagues, not guys. This is Albany and King Lear by Shakespeare. I told you I love Shakespeare. Striving to better, oft we mar what's well. That's a Shakespearean way of saying that the best is the enemy of the good. Don't try too hard. Because if you do try too hard, you will fall flat on your face. Keep it simple, be humble in your English. Just say it as it should be said, and don't try too hard. Because this is what happens. Very frequently, people in a B language, they learn lovely phrases, which I said you should do, yes, correctly, but only use them if you know exactly in what context they're used and exactly how you say them. Very frequently, I find my students will try and learn nice expressions in English and they'll get one word wrong. If you do that, all it does is bring attention to the fact that you are not an English speaker, rather than impressing people, which is what you wanted to do. So a good example of that. I was sitting in a meeting at NATO. We had a colleague who was almost bilingual, but not quite. He thought he was bilingual, and he liked to use very flowery expressions. You know, it's his style. And so one time, the French delegate was saying in the meeting room, well, à froid, je ne peux rien vous dire. So he says, Just like that, off the cuff, I can't tell you, what my country's position is, à froid. It means without being able to reflect, without having time to think about it. And so my colleague says, well, cold turkey, I can't tell you. Now, cold turkey doesn't mean that. Cold turkey means you're a drug addict and you go off the drugs, you're going cold turkey. Now, the word cold was the same, but nothing else. And so that sort of thing, you need to avoid doing it. Don't try too hard unless you're totally sure that you got it right. I always say that if you sprinkle your speech with these nice expressions, and all you're doing, if you get them wrong, is drawing attention. It's like a diamond sitting in a sea of shit. It sort of, it doesn't fit. It doesn't fit the rest of your discourse. And that brings me to the idea of register. Your register has to be constant. You can't have a word up here and then a word down here. You have to have a more or less constant register in your B language. So learning beautiful phrases is fine, but only if everything in your interpreting is equally beautiful, and it won't be. Don't use too many words. This is a quotation from the Bible, because I'm also a deacon in the church, so my Christian faith means a lot to me. So I always quote the Bible. Use not vain repetitions as the heathen do, for they think they shall be heard for their much speaking. Now, what that means is that in a B language, you can't find exactly the right word, okay? So what do? You add 10 more words, hoping somehow you're going to get close to the idea. But all that does is confuse things even further. So rather than using more words, use fewer words. Just keep it simple and get the idea across. Then as you improve and you evolve, then you can start to do the complicated stuff. And you can start quoting Shakespeare and the Bible and that sort of thing. I think we may be close to the end, so what else we got? Yes, this is something else which you need to think about. When you work out of your A language, you understand everything, right? Because it's easy. Spanish, you understand, no effort. But that doesn't mean that you are capable of actually explaining what you've understood, because your English probably isn't good enough. But people tend to think because they've understood, they've explained it. But the tool which you have, your B language tool, isn't necessarily good enough for that. So again, bear in mind, okay, I've understood it. Now let me make sure I get most of that idea across. Maybe not every nuance, but most of it. And that basically is it. So do you want me to show you that? Let's have a look at, see what any more questions, shall we? First, and then we can perhaps look at that quick poem. SR-71 Blackbird, the spy plane, the Gary Powers spy plane from Jason. I take it Jason knows all about the Gary Powers incident with the SR-71 that was shot down. I hope you do. What's your opinion on professional practices? How soon should students start participating in real life interpreting experiences? Should they only interpret into their A language at first? Well, I think, Eliana, I think that the more you can be exposed to real life interpreting in a professional context, the sooner you can, the better. Now, that doesn't mean you can actually do it. I don't think you should start to try and interpret at the professional level during the first month of your master's degree, because it will be counterproductive, because you can't do it. But you should be exposed to it. You should listen to professional interpreters. You can go online and do it at the UN or the European Union. You can't at NATO because it's all classified and secret, so nothing is public. But you should. And if you possibly can, now again, I speak here knowing that your school maybe doesn't agree with this, because some schools don't. I personally interpret at church every Sunday. I interpret all the service from English into French. And I take my students with me. This Sunday, I'll be working with a student. Last Sunday I was. So to them, it's real life interpreting practice. Now, obviously, I'm there next to them. If they can't do it, I take over immediately. Because, of course, in a real life situation, customers need you. You can't just mess it up, which is why practice is good, dummy boothing is better, and then gradually you can start to take on real assignments. So in my situation with the church, for example, I say, I can only do it because I'm with them. And the minute there's a problem, I just take over. And that way the customer doesn't suffer, because you can't train on the backs of the customers. because the customers need proper interpretation. If you can't do it, it's not fair to them to impose your errors on them. But real life practice with real delegates who need you, they give you adrenaline. It's often much easier to motivate yourself when you know people need you. A lot of students find that in the classroom situation, especially when it's online, there's no motivation because they know that the teachers understand and they are not fulfilling a functional role. Whereas in the real world, you are. People need you. People come and thank you. People look around and say, yes, thank you. And they are, yes, I understand. And that is a massive motivator. And we need the motivation because interpreting is hard. And we do need injections of motivation to make us realize that we are actually helping people, which is probably one of the reasons why we love interpreting, because we get to help people understand each other. So I would say, Eliana, that you should do it as much as you can, as early as you can. Yes, it's true. You probably shouldn't start working into your B, but you shouldn't do anything in interpreting if you can't do it correctly. So that holds true for an A.
Esperemos que vuelva a conectarse.
I vanished again. Am I back?
There you are. Yeah.
Okay. So that's more or less it. I don't know whether there are any more questions or whether you want to see the poem. Up to you. You tell me.
Chris, there is one more question in the chat.
Okay. Let me have a look. Oh, yes, it is.
From Lucas.
A long one too. Yeah, I got it. Hello, I was wondering, do you think having a C language interferes when it comes to obtaining job opportunities? For the time being, I only speak Spanish and English, though I'm planning on learning a C language as well. I do not know if it's a requirement, because if this is the case, I should. Okay. Well, it depends entirely, Luca, on the market you're aiming at. Generally speaking, I would say that not having a C is not a problem. If you work biactively, that is where the demand is, certainly in Europe. I don't know, I think it's probably the same in Argentina. The demand is very much biactive. I have students, for example, who now work in Paris. I have two students who have French and Italian AA, English B. They both have the same profile. And they've both been working now for 2 or 3 years in Paris on the biactive market. And not once have they been asked to work with their Italian. It's all French, English biactive. And in Argentina, I assume it's all Spanish, English biactive. So I would say, quite frankly, not having a C is probably not much of a problem for you. I don't know your market intimately, so I could be wrong. But I do know that throughout the world, biactive with English is always the big demand. And it's increasingly the case. I would say that C languages are less and less important, unless you work for the UN or the EU, where, for political reasons, you have to have several Cs. For the EU, you have to have at least 3. For the UN, about the same, really. But everywhere else on the private market, it's biactive. That's where the demand is. So I would say, don't worry about a C. You can add it later if you want to, but it might just be for your own personal pleasure or interest. But there's not going to be much of a demand for it. I have other students here in Belgium who are, in fact, I had dinner with one tonight, who are on the private market. And then this girl, for example, she has English B, French A, and German C. And in 3 years, she hasn't used German once, not once, because there is no demand for it. The demand is biactive. So don't worry about it, Luca, I would say.
Thank you.
So that's, I think, more or less it. What time is it? Yes, I'm getting back to my wife shortly because it's midnight 30 here. Do you want to watch the poem?
Please.
About English? Okay, just let me call it up. It actually was written by a Dutchman, strangely enough, who was trying to learn English, and he despaired of learning English. me find it for you. Won't take a second. In fact, when I listened to this poem, I realized that English is impossible to learn. I don't know why anyone tries, it's just impossible. Okay, I've got to find it first. Where is it? Oh, I know where it is. I know where it is. I suddenly remember where it is. So we find the relevant folder. It won't take a second. Here it is. It's in here, and it's in here. Right, we're getting closer. I'm almost there now. I'm probably speaking faster because I'm tired, so I do apologize.
Too late for you. Midnight.
It's quite
past midnight, actually.
Yeah, it is past midnight, definitely. I got it. I found it. Right, good. So I'll just share my screen again. Are you ready for the chaos? Thank you to people who are saying thank you. It's my pleasure to help you. And I do hope I have helped a little bit. Hope I haven't depressed you. Here we go. Are you ready for the chaos? Right. Are you seeing the screen?
Yes.
Okay.
Intro to the wonderful Jimmy Jam's Internet Show. Oh, yeah.
Because life tastes better when you spread the jam.
Welcome to Jimmy Jams. I'm Jim. Let's jam. This is a little different today. In deference to my international friends out there that are terrorized by trying to learn English pronunciation, today I'm going to bring you a shortened version of the poem by Dutchman Gerard Nolst Trinité titled The Chaos. Dearest creature in creation, study English pronunciation. I'll teach you in my verse. Sounds like corpse, core, and horse, and worse. I'll keep you, Susie, busy. Make your head with heat grow dizzy. Tear and eye, your dress will tear. So shall I, oh, hear my prayer. Just compare heart, beard, and herd. Dies and diet, lord and word. Sword and sword, retain and Britain. Mind the latter how it's written. Now, I surely will not plague you with such words as plaque and ague, but be careful how you speak. Say break and stake, but bleak and streak. Cloven, oven, how and low. Script, receipt, show, poem, and toe. Hear me say, devoid of trickery, daughter, laughter, and terpsichore. Typhoid, measles, topsels, isles, exiles, similes, and reviles. Scholar, vicar, and cigar. Solar, mica, war, and far. One, anemone, Balmoral. Kitchen, lichen, laundry, laurel. Gertrude, German. Wind and mine. Scene, Melpomene, mankind. Billet does not rhyme with ballet. Bouquet, wallet, mallet, chalet. Blood and flood are not like food, nor is mold like should and would. Viscous, viscount. Load and broad. Toward to forward to reward. And your pronunciation is okay when you correctly say croquet. Rounded, wounded, grieve, and sieve. Friend and fiend, alive and live. Ivy, privy, famous, clamor. And enamor rhyme with hammer. River, rival, tomb, bomb, comb, doll, and roll, and some, and home. Stranger does not rhyme with anger, neither does devour with clangor. Souls but foul, haunt but ant, font, front, want, grand, and grant. Shoes, goes, does. Now, first say finger, and then singer, ginger, linger. Real zeal, mauve, gauze, gouge, and gauge. Marriage, foliage, mirage, and age. Query does not rhyme with very, nor does fury sound like bury. Dust, lost, post, and doth cloth loathe. Job, knob, bosom, transom, oath. Though the difference seem little, we say actual, but victual. Refer does not rhyme with defer. Pfeffer does, and zephyr, heifer. Mint, pint, senate and sedate. Dull, bull, and George 8 late. Scenic, Arabic, Pacific. Science, conscience, scientific. Liberty, library, heave, and heaven. Rachel Ake, mustache 11. We say hallowed but allowed. People, leopard, toad but vowed. Mark the differences, moreover, between mover, cover, clover. Leeches, breeches, wise, precise. Chalice, but police and lice. Camel, constable, unstable. Principal, disciple, label, petal, panel, and canal. Wait, surprise, plate, promise, pal. Worm and storm. Chase, chaos, chair. Senator, spectator, mayor. Tour, but hour. And sucker, 4. Gas, alas, and Arkansas. Sea, idea, Korea, area. Psalm, Maria, but malaria. Youth, south, southern, cleanse and clean. Doctrine, turpentine, marine. Compare alien with Italian, dandelion, and battalion. Sally with ally, yea, ye. I, way, and key. Say a verb, but ever fever. Neither leisure, skein, deceiver. Heron, granary, canary. Crevice and device and airy. Face, but preface, not efface. Phlegm, phlegmatic. Ass, glass, base. Large but target, gin, give, verging. Ought, out, joust, and scour. Scourging. Ear, but earn, and wear, and tear. Do not rhyme, but hear, but air. 7 is right, but so is even. Hyphen, roughen, nephew Stephen. Monkey, donkey, Turk, and jerk. Asp, grasp, wasp, and cork and work. Pronunciation, think of psyche, is a paling stout and spiky. Won't it make you lose your wits writing groats but saying grits? It's a dark abyss or tunnel, strewn with stones, stowed solace, gunnel. Islington and Isle of Wight. Housewife, verdict, and indict. Finally, which rhymes with enough? Though, through, plow, or dough, or cough. Hiccup has the sound of cup. My advice is to give up.
Muy bueno. That's good. I think you are muted.
I beg your pardon. I was just saying it gives you an idea of how fiendishly complex English is. And don't give up, like he said. Keep going, okay?
Keep on trying.
What I didn't say, I should have said to you from the beginning, was that I'm quite happy to send you the PowerPoint as well, if you want the PowerPoint. So again, remind me, Norma, of that tomorrow, and I will send it to you.
Okay. We will.
Well, it's been a joy working with you. If I can do any more, I have many more masterclasses, so just ask if it helps you.
We will. We certainly will. And hopefully we will be able to meet personally sometime here in Buenos Aires. You will be very welcome.
Thank you.
Very, very welcome.
And thank you to all of you who are saying thank you. It was a pleasure. And
thank you. We are very, very grateful, really. It's been brilliant. I think everyone has enjoyed it.
Good. It's worth all the pain. It's a fantastic job. So I know there are times when you cry. We've all been there, but it's worth it. Hang in there.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much for your generosity, because it's late there. So thank you so much. We take your word.
Problem.
I take your word on the complexities of English for next time.
Okay. Buenas noches. So keep in touch. And remind me. Good night.
Muchas gracias, Chris. Bye bye.
Hasta luego.
Hasta pronto.
Bye bye. Hasta pronto.
Bye bye.
Dejamos nuestro email también, dejamos ir a Cris, que ya son casi la 1 de la mañana allá, así que muchas gracias a todos por participar. Ahí en el chat box puse el mail por si alguno quiere contactarnos o para quedar en contacto ya sea por el material que prometió dejar Cris. Bueno, seguimos en contacto vía mail. Gracias a todos nuevamente. Y quería agradecer también especialmente a Santiago Kersul, que al principio de la exposición no mencioné el programa ATI-USAR, que también es ya para intérpretes profesionales que quieran especializarse en lo que es interpretación técnica, interpretación especializada, así que cualquier duda, tanto de este programa como cualquiera de los demás que mencioné al principio, nos pueden escribir, y bueno, ya sea Norma, Santiago o nosotros, vamos a estar gustosos de responder todas sus preguntas. Así que muchas gracias nuevamente, y gracias Norma a vos por haber traído a Cris, que realmente fue excepcional su charla.
Me alegro, gracias, gracias.
Muy
Gracias.
claro.
Espero que haya sido para todos.
Por la organización.
Gracias, chicos. Bueno, nos vemos entonces la próxima.
Nos vemos la
Nos
próxima.
vemos.
Muchas gracias por todo. Gracias.
Gracias.
Hasta pronto.